For hundreds of years, House Lightbringer has ruled over the nation of Andaron. The Lightbringers were once seen as the saviors of the realm, having vanquished the terrors who once roamed the region with their powerful light magic and their holy Lightbringer shrines. However, as with all good things, they must eventually come to a close. This is the story of how the Lightbringers' rule over Andaron ended. This is the story of Thorgrim's rebellion, an extremely important war occurring 5 years prior to the events of Andaron Saga. The cracks in the Lightbringers' reign started with the arrival of the Styxian Plague, rumored to have been transferred to Andaron via the many trade caravans passing through the Flameguard Pass. The Styxian Plague ravaged the nation for several years, wiping out roughly 1/5 of Andaron's total population. This horrible plague was followed by a famine, which led to even more deaths. With these two tragic calamities, the infrastructure of the nation started to collapse. At this point in time, King Cathis Lightbringer sat upon the throne in the Andaron capital of Malthrak. He was viewed by many as a weak king even before the plague struck, and the resulting famine did little to improve people's perception of his rule. It was at this time that whispers of a rebellion started being heard, and they came from one of the noble houses situated closest to the capital, House Steel. The ruling lord of this house, Thorgrim, a mighty warrior and renowned general of many battles, was the one to first declare open rebellion against the crown. Thorgrim had 3 sons, Randall, Baudimon, and Mortimer. At this point, Mortimer was much too young to partake in the conflict, but Randall and Baudimon were each given command of a large army. Randall was tasked with defending Castle Steel, while Baudimon was sent out into the field. House Steel's close proximity to the capital made this rebellion a very surprising move, as the Lightbringers were in perfect position to quash it, but soon after it was announced, several other noble houses joined in. House Rose, known for their chivalry and beauty, were the first to join the rebels. Their close ties to House Steel made them natural allies, and their involvement in the rebellion came as no surprise. Next was House Flameguard. Thorgrim himself took a Flameguard noble named Maria for his wife many years prior, so the two houses were naturally joined together by marriage. To everyone's surprise, however, House Windlands, one of the oldest and most respected houses of Andaron, also sided with the rebels. With their esteemed Pegasus Knights partaking in the battle, their involvement caused the rebellion to go from a small-scale uprising to an actual legitimate threat to the crown. Even the Centaurs, the true native people of Andaron, joined the battlefield, hired as mercenaries by Thorgrim. Their powerful charges, combined with their hit-and-run attacks, proved to be extremely effective, but they were unruly and difficult to control. Rising up against the rebels and declaring their allegiance for the crown were the Axe Knights of House Ashburn, the Bow Knights of House Ring, and the Lance Knights of House Speargarden. House Speargarden's involvement in particular spelled real trouble for the usurpers, as they had the largest and most disciplined army, led by one of Andaron's most esteemed generals, Alexander. General Alexander was such a fearsome general that armies would sometimes surrender merely by hearing of his approach. All the way over to the west, the mysterious House Darkholm remained eerily silent, apparently choosing to remain neutral in the coming conflict. With the stage set, the noble houses began preparing for war, and so it began, the bloodiest conflict Andaron had ever seen. Thorgrim's rebellion caused the rivers to run red with blood. Entire cities were burned to the ground, armies clashed on the battlefield, thousands died. The rebellion was so brutal that many question if there even would be an Andaron left to rule at the end of it. Sometime after the rebellion broke out, Thorgrim's wife Maria was kidnapped from her castle by agents of the king and brought back to the capital. King Cathis later sent a messenger to Castle Steel demanding their immediate surrender, but Thorgrim refused to comply and continued the rebellion anyway. A few weeks later, news was spreading all across Andaron that the Lightbringers had executed Maria in gruesome fashion. This act sent shockwaves through the nation. Several noble houses denounced the crown for this dishonorable act. House Flameguard in particular, which had been Maria's family, were enraged by this. And House Speargarden, which had previously supported the crown unflinchingly, seemed to have their resolve weakened by this incident. Despite this incident, the rebellion seemed to favor the crown. Several years later, after many grueling defeats, Thorgrim, alongside his son Randall, were both pushed back all the way across the continent to the eastern city of Holtmire. The ships of the city had been burned prior to their arrival, cutting off their only escape. While the walls of Holtmire were strong, Thorgrim was trapped in the city with no way out, and with a huge army led by King Cathis Lightbringer himself soon arriving at his doorstep, it appeared to be the end of the rebellion. Meanwhile, Baudimon, Thorgrim's middle son, leading a sizable army, made an attempt to come to his father's rescue, but he made a crucial error. In order to reach Holtmire, he needed to break through a bridge held by the enemy, but due to bad intel and poor weather conditions, the army he attacked turned out to be 3 times larger than what he had originally anticipated. While Baudimon succeeded in breaking through the bridge with a small force, he quickly found himself cut off from the rest of his men, and ended up trapped behind enemy lines. There, he met up with some stragglers from the battle, and formed a small warband. Thinking that it was only a matter of time before he and his men were captured, Baudimon decided he would do what he could to hurt the enemy as much as possible. His band started raiding enemy supply lines at night, slipping back into the cover of the forest during day. This proved to be surprisingly effective, and the band quickly gained a reputation as heroes, their legend growing by the day. At this point, King Cathis had already laid siege to the city of Holtmire, and the walls would not hold out for much longer. It was in this moment that shocking news broke. House Beargarden had unexpectedly decided to side with the rebels. Furthermore, a large army of lance knights led by General Alexander were marching towards Holtmire to come to Thorgrim's aid. This brought new hope to the rebels, but things were still looking bleak. Thorgrim and his oldest son Randall were still trapped in the city, and if they were killed, the rebellion was as good as over. General Alexander would not arrive in Holtmire until at least another week, and even if he did make it, it would be too late. In these crucial hours, Baudimon made the decision to come to his father's aid, even though he commanded less than 50 men. During the cover of darkness, Baudimon's rebels managed to sneak into the enemy camp surrounding Holtmire and set their siege weapons ablaze. The enemy did not expect this and were caught completely unaware. By the time they put the fires out, Baudimon and his men were already gone, and most of the siege weapons were destroyed. This act of heroism completely revitalized the rebels. King Cathis Lightbringer were advised to lift the siege and return to the capital, but stubbornly he decided to press on. He ordered his army to attack Holtmire with the siege equipment they had left, but it was a huge mistake, and the crown suffered a stunning defeat. It is said that while the Lightbringer army broke against the walls of Holtmire, the Baudimon's rebels joined the battlefield, and that Thorgrim himself charged out of the city gates with his royal guard to trample the fleeing Lightbringer soldiers. It was an absolute massacre. This defeat quickly rippled through Andaron, bringing new hope to the rebels. While King Cathis Lightbringer was able to secure a ship and flee all the way back to the capital, his standing army was decimated and scattered. It did not take long until House Ring and House Ashbourne surrendered, leaving the crown to fend for themselves. Now joining up with the army led by Alexander, Thorgrim quickly marched on the capital of Malthrak and put it under siege. Baudimon had taken an arrow during the siege of Holtmire and was not well enough to travel, but Thorgrim's other 2 sons, Randall and Mortimer, had joined up with him when the siege began. The capital fell in less than a day, and the royal palace was besieged the very same night. At this point, the Lightbringers had lost all will to fight, and many surrendered without even taking up arms. Despite this, Thorgrim mercilessly ordered his men to slaughter the entire royal family, and he personally beheaded King Cathis Lightbringer himself while the king was still sitting on his throne. Every single member of the royal family was murdered, with the exception of the youngest princess and her retainer, whose bodies were never found. They were both assumed to have perished in the flames. With the capital in ruins, Thorgrim tossed aside the headless body of the former king and sat himself down upon the silver throne. He picked up the crown, still bloody from its former wearer, and declared himself Andaron's next king. His first order to his people was for them to tear down every single Lightbringer shrine across Andaron. Their old traditional ways were no longer going to be followed. The people of Andaron, weary of war and suffering, hesitantly accepted Thorgrim's reign, hoping that at the very least, the bloodshed would finally come to an end. It has now been 5 years since Thorgrim's rebellion ended, and while times have been relatively peaceful, the people of Andaron have never truly warmed up to their new king. Reconstruction has been slow, as Thorgrim tends to focus most of the crown's resources towards the military, putting their needs over that of the citizenry. As of late, however, the king has caught a terrible illness and looks to be on his deathbed. His oldest son Randall is now getting ready to succeed the crown, and the nation holds its breath, anticipating the reign of the king to come. Will Randall be a better ruler than his father, or will he be worse? These are questions the people of Andaron ask themselves daily. Meanwhile, during all of this, trouble is brewing in the east, as the Dragon Kingdom of Tiamat is supposedly constructing military forts in the mountains, a blatant act of aggression that has the people of Andaron quite worried. Thorgrim decides to send an envoy to the Dragon Kingdom, but instead of choosing his successor Randall, or the more politically savvy Mortimer, he decides Baudimon is the one who will lead the negotiations, despite his lacking diplomatic experience. How will Andaron respond to this new threat in its weakened state? Find out how this story continues when Andaron Saga comes out.